forces. We developed a vaccine against Ebola. They made very rapid progress. And just before Christmas, the Lancet published the results of the final test showing that the vaccine gives effective protection. And I think in a way this is truly worth celebrating, because now we know how to respond much faster the next time. But although it was nearly a record-breaking development of a vaccine, it was too late for thousands who lost their lives and livelihoods. It has a devastating effect on economics, on human lives and societies. It's matched only by wars and environmental disasters. If you look at what Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia suffered on economic loss of at least $3 billion as a result of Ebola, and we know that SARS cost $40 billion, and a flu epidemic can cost several $100 billion if it really gets strong and affects. We need to be more aware, and this was what we set out a year ago. We thought it would be better to be prepared, to be ahead, instead of responding afterwards. And in this world, I think taking epidemics seriously, we know that we have problems with antibiotics not functioning anymore, that we get resistance to it. We know that vaccines is a way of handling also known diseases today that might not be vaccine against today because we think the antibiotics can work it. In the future they might have to be vaccinated against. There is a need to be much more prepared. And I co-chair the UN Secretary General's Development Goals Advocacy Group, and I think epidemics is undermining all of those 17 goals. And for Norway, you might say Ebola was far away. No, it wasn't. We got one of the doctors back home. We know what it was, and we are a highly developed country. We know how much money we use on one patient and to make sure that it didn't affect the rest. And we know that all of these epidemics move so fast that if we were very lucky just getting only one patient, we could have got more. And we got a patient we knew was sick when she left and came to Norway. We knew it. We could isolate it. We can make sure that we are prepared to help her. But that's why it comes out. This is not just for the countries that are developing. This is also for developed countries. It's the same problem.
I think that's an incredibly important point. This is not just foreign assistance, which is something that Norway plays an enormous role in. This is self-interest too. It's enlightened self-interest. Jeremy, let's turn to you. And we've just heard from the Prime Minister the broad background as to why it made sense and makes sense for Norway and other governments to support this. From your perspective, as Director of the Wellcome Trust, you've been kind of at the coalface of working in and dealing with epidemics. Give me your sense of what the need is here that CEPI is fulfilling. What concretely does it need to do to be successful?
I think it's, so I speak now as a clinician. When I spent the last 20 years or so living in Vietnam and lived through SARS and bird flu and then been very involved in the epidemic since then. It's very difficult to get across to an audience just how frightening it is to be at the epicenter of that. You question your whole professionalism, you question whether you should stay at work, you question whether you should go home to your families. And this is what every healthcare worker feels. And I think when we're pausing here just for a second, I think we should all just reach out and thank those healthcare workers around the world who worked during Ebola, working during Zika now, just to thank them, because they are working in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. They're not protected. We have no vaccines to protect them. And they're doing so, and they make all of our lives slightly safer. I would like to have a world where we never have to ask a healthcare worker in future to go into an epidemic without knowing that they're protected. And CEPI, I think, can achieve this. We should bear in mind that with environment change, climate change, and of course globalization and travel, what happens in Lagos will affect Davos tomorrow. What happens in New York will happen in Beijing. The world is connected. You will all fly after you leave here at Davos and go to almost every country on the earth within a 12 or 14-hour flight. And yet the world is incredibly vulnerable. If I look to just my own experience over 12 years, SARS, Nipah, bird flu, Zika, Ebola, and ask ourselves, do we have interventions which fit the 21st century? Yes, we have public health, yes, we have hand washing, and yes, we have masks, but we had those in the 19th century. And I think what CEPI is going to go and do, vaccines are not the answer to everything, but it will say that the vaccine space for emerging infections, we will have a vaccine for the most important potential emerging infections, and we will do so by working across governments, philanthropy and industry, and we will change the paradigm by which we make vaccines for these epidemics.
We will come on to exactly how that will happen a little later in this discussion. I wanted first to turn to His Excellency Alpha Conde, President of Guinea, because I think you, Mr. President, can give us a first-hand account of what was the impact that Ebola had on Guinea. What is the world we are now in that CEPI is trying to improve the position of?
D'abord, je dois remercier tous les personnels qui sont venus en Guinée au Libéria et en Sierra Leone, malgré tous les risques, et qui nous ont aidés à finir cette maladie. Beaucoup, certains ont laissé la vie, d'autres étaient malades. Je dois remercier aussi le ministre Norvège et
I'd like to thank also the Prime Minister of Norway
En fait, nous avons,
and CEPI for this
pourquoi
initiative.
nous avons eu d'Ebola, ça s'est développé pour deux raisons.
We
Notre
believe
système
that there are two
sanitaire
important
n'était pas à la
reasons
hauteur.
for this
Vous avez
epidemic.
245
Our
vaccins
healthcare
pour 100 000
system
habitants aux États-Unis,
wasn't
seulement
up
10 pour
to
la Guinée.
scratch, 245
Ensuite,
doctors for
nos
100,000 people in the
infrastructures
US,
ne sont pas
far
très
less
développées.
in
Mais le
Guinea.
problème le plus
And
important,
our
c'est
infrastructures
notre système sanitaire.
aren't
Donc, si
sufficiently
on veut
developed
éviter
either.
d'autres
But we really need
épidémies,
to
il
focus
faut
on
que
our
nos
healthcare
pays
systems.
africains aient un système
We
sanitaire qui
need
soit à la hauteur,
really
ça
to
donne la richesse.
promote quality
Aujourd'hui, nous avons la
healthcare
chance.
systems
La France nous
in
accompagne
Africa.
en
And
créant
we
un
have
institut
support
pour
for
la
this.
Guinée.
We
D'ici
have
en région,
support
nous
from the
accompagne.
Pasteur Institute,
Donc,
from
la première de ces
other French
propositions,
institutions,
c'est
American
avoir un
institutions
système. La
to
deuxième,
achieve this goal.
c'est
So
la
that's
santé
one
communautaire.
important thing.
Très souvent, on nous
Improving
envoie,
healthcare
c'est bien,
systems.
on nous
Secondly,
envoie
community
des
health.
ONG
Quite
qui nous accompagnent,
often
mais souvent ils connaissent pas
we
nos coutumes,
have
ils connaissent pas
NGOs who
que c'est
come
important,
who
ça
do
communiquer
help,
avec
but
la population.
who
Ce
aren't
qui fait
familiar
que
with
une maladie comme
our
Ebola,
customs,
où
our
on voit les
traditions.
gens habillés
So in
comme
the
des
case of
cosmonautes,
Ebola,
les villages sont pas habités, ça fait très peur.
where
Et l'Ebola est contraire à toutes nos cultures. Par exemple, chez nous, dans beaucoup
have
d'ethnies,
a
on
cultural
embrasse le mort,
impact as
etc.
well, where
Et
there
tout
are
ça, ça
different
transmet
ethnic groups
l'Ebola.
involved. It's
Et
important
ensuite,
to really
on doit
understand
aussi
the
faire un
customs
peu
and
plus
traditions
confiance au
as well.
gouvernement pour le
If you're
transfert
going
de
to be
technologie. Parce que
if
souvent,
you're going
nous
to be
avons des
effective,
contradictions. Moi, j'ai eu
we
beaucoup
also
de
need to
problèmes
work on
avec
transfer of
des
technology.
organisations. On m'a même
I've
accusé de
worked with
mini-management. Parce que c'est nous qui
organisations
sommes responsables de la population. C'est nous qui sommes souffrants. Donc,
are
très souvent,
working
on
with
nous annonce
us,
qu'ils
but
sont très
ultimately
énormes.
it is
Les
us who are
populations
responsible
ça,
for
on les
our
reçoit pas.
populations.
Et très souvent,
Quite
ce
often,
qui nous
we
inquiète,
find
c'est
it's
que
difficult to
une bonne
transmit
partie
the
de l'argent est dépensé
technology
dans les hôtels, faut aussi les
and
appliquer
use of
dans
technology
les hôtels, dans les
to
loins,
the
etc.
populations,
Et non pas à
and
soigner.
difficult to get
Beaucoup,
the
si nous avons des
message
gens très
across.
doués comme médecins sans
So,
frontières d'autres qui sont sur le
when
terrain,
we work with
nous avons beaucoup d'autres
organisations
qui restent dans les
in the
hôtels à
field,
5 étoiles.
quite
Et ça
often
ne fonctionne pas.
we
Donc,
find
il faut
that they
que-
expect
il y a
us
des
to do the
ONG
field
locaux,
work and stay
mais il faut qu'on
Conakry
travaille avec le gouvernement pour
in
y transférer la
hotels
technologie.
and really
Vous avez
don't
la
get
chance en
familiar
Guinée,
with
les
how to
médecins
transmit
ont
the
beaucoup
technology
participé,
or
on a eu
become
beaucoup de
familiar
moyens,
with,
au moins, les
with
médecins ont appris.
real life in our
Ensuite, il
country.
y a aussi un peu la
So
concurrence
there's
entre
work
les
needs to be
laboratoires.
done there.
Par exemple,
There's
les
also
vaccins.
important
Moi, j'ai pris le risque
work in the area
d'essayer
of
des vaccins. Je
research.
disais non, c'est pas sûr.
Vaccinations, for example, I took the risk of trying a vaccination. I was told it
Et
wasn't
grâce à cela, nous avons pu
100%
vacciner
safe,
plus de
but I
2000 personnes.
wanted to go
Et
ahead
aujourd'hui, on voit que le vaccin est efficace.
and try it to see that
il y a
it was
aussi le
safe.
fait que
It's then been
les
rolled
laboratoires
out
pour les luttes
and has been
pour avoir le marché
successful.
peuvent retarder.
Now we know that
l'utilisation
there are
des vaccins.
sometimes
Donc ça, on doit se parler franchement, parce que nous
difficult
avons
to
souffert.
encourage
Nous avons été isolés, notre
companies
communauté
to
à terre,
do the
mais il faut qu'on
necessary
se parle
research, but we
franchement.
need to mobilize this
si on
research
se
and we
parle
need
pas
to
franchement,
increase
on
its
peut pas avancer.
effectiveness. If we're going to be honest about this, we need to work in all of these areas. Thank you.
Well, Mr. President, I'd just like to push you on one element of that, which is you have laid out the many aspects of the response that are needed, and you also said that you took, and as you did, you had the vaccine trial in Guinea. What would have happened if you'd had a vaccine in weeks, which is what CEPI is trying to reach? What difference would that have made to the experience that you had with Ebola?
Non, évidemment, si on avait disposé
of
de
course,
vaccins,
if we'd have had
à mon avis, ce
it
serait
a
pas
lot quicker,
étendu. Bon,
then
elle vient de reconnaître qu'il y a eu un retard.
the epidemic wouldn't have spread as
L'Organisation
far.
mondiale de la santé n'a
And
pas
the
réagi.
WHO,
Ça,
we
c'est une
feel,
vérité.
didn't react in time. That's a fact. I think we're very grateful to Médecins Sans Frontières, who did really get into the field quickly. When we did have the vaccine, we first of all vaccinated the doctors and healthcare workers, many volunteers, and they didn't get ill. If we'd have had it earlier, it would have been effective, and it would have certainly stopped the spread of Ebola, protecting the population. So it would have been extremely important. It would have had a huge effect. We want to see vaccination that is 100% reliable and 100% financed, so that we really can take care of people. Well, I'm not just talking about Ebola here, I'm talking about other hemorrhagic fever diseases. So thank you very much for asking me that question.
So, Bill Gates, there you heard it, would have been there within weeks. You are known as someone who likes concrete numbers and metrics of success. So I'd like to get your sense of, first of all, why did you support this? But secondly, what do you expect and hope that CEPI will achieve?
Well, unfortunately, even though there's a substantial risk of various types of epidemics, there's not a natural marketplace. There's not a natural incentive for people to build products that anticipate that. It simply wouldn't make sense for the private sector on its own to do this work. And so when we look at this kind of risk, the epidemic risk, you've got to bring governments and foundations together to create the right incentive structure. So the good news is that the ability to make vaccines quickly, it may be possible to get that to be dramatically less than it's been. There's a new approach that is sometimes called DNA, RNA vaccines, that the part you would change to go after a new disease would be a very small part of it. And so a lot of the work, the safety work, the manufacturing work, you could cut that out. It would be even easier than for flu vaccine today doing this seasonal adaptation that is done on a yearly basis. And so the good news is that if you can either predict what the pathogen is going to be and get that stockpiled, that's the ideal. Then you have a very, very quick response. The second best case is if you didn't anticipate the pathogen, then you get using the private sector capability that these CEPI-funded projects will have helped advance. You'll very quickly go in and say, okay, make a vaccine. We don't know how quickly that can be done, but if we can get it down to a year, that would be very good. Now, every week counts. We have simulations showing that if you can get out in 6 weeks, then even a flu epidemic, which is a very fast-spreading epidemic, you can have a dramatic benefit to. That's not to say we know that we can get down to that kind of a shorter time frame. Flu is one actually we should invest because we know it's there. We should invest in it. I'm sure it'll get done by various actors in a universal vaccine for that. So CEPI is very exciting. It's enough to probably do several of these vaccines and really engage the private sector in a concrete way before the next emergency hits. Nobody really knew which approach should be taken, which diagnostics should be done. There are things that CEPI does not cover. It doesn't cover antiviral drugs or diagnostics. And so there should be follow-on efforts for those things, nor does it cover some of the governance questions like how do you allocate vaccines during a crisis like this. So there are still really important ongoing discussions on those issues, but I really want to thank the partners who come in. Just in the discussions in the last year, everyone's taken a leap of faith to pull this together, and even in the next year, we'll have the staff, and I think we'll actually bid out a couple of these projects. So this is a substantial step that deals with a problem that can keep you up at night if you think enough about it, which is the world's not really ready for a lot of these epidemics. And Ebola was awful it could have been even worse. There was even an element of luck that it didn't get into Nigeria in a big way. There was an element of luck that it stopped where it did, and it raised so many questions that we need to be better prepared for next time.
I want to come back in a second and ask you about how big that ambition is, of how far you're going to go. But first, I wanted to bring Andrew in and get your sense from the pharmaceutical industry perspective of what is it that is missing? What is it that you need most that CEPI can help bring to push this forward?
I think what CEPI does for all of the vaccine companies, and the 6 of the companies who joined in to CEPI, I think all feel very much the same way. Planning, prioritization, and a mechanism to essentially create increased capacity in the space of research into these rare, unusual, but potentially deadly pathogenic threats. So if you think about what happens in an epidemic or a pandemic situation, first of all, there's almost no spare capacity in the global vaccine industry. If you walk around any of our vaccine plants, they are running full on. All the lines are busy because the world is growing. There is more and more need for vaccine. So the red phone rings, and it's the WHO saying there's a crisis and we need an Ebola vaccine. Immediately after the WHO rings, a couple of countries start ringing to say we want this vaccine now. That's an almost impossible situation for a company to try and to react to. So, and it's so disorganized because actually the world doesn't know if there's a vaccine candidate ready. They don't know whether there's any capacity lined up ready to go. The companies aren't anticipating that phone call. And what CEPI starts to do is to take the kind of things where we've had to react in the middle of the battle of the epidemic and take those things back to peacetime so that we can start to resolve these issues, start to say, yes, we're not perfect, we haven't got perfect foresight, but we can more or less estimate that from these 12 potential pathogens, there's a reasonable chance one of them could be the next pandemic. So let's start working on them. It doesn't mean we're going to get everything right, but let's at least start working. How do we start to think about taking vaccine candidates through to the end of phase 2 so that when a pandemic starts, instead of discussing and debating how to do a phase 2 trial, we go straight to phase 3? Those are the sorts of progress points we can make. Why is that sensible for us? Because at the end of the day, when it really boils down to it, the only people who are going to make a vaccine for the world are the 6 vaccine manufacturers. And so it's in our interest to make this situation much less stressful, much easier for us to react to without disrupting all of the other day-to-day vaccine manufacturers. Because we were very close, I think, in the 3 companies who were most advanced in Ebola. If it had indeed got worse, we would have all been put in the very difficult position of saying, do we make Ebola vaccine at scale or do we make rotavirus vaccine or another vaccine? And then the world is making a completely invidious choice, which could have been avoided. And that's why we're so supportive of CEPI, and I think all 6 companies who are represented here today have worked very, very well to help bring this to fruition.
So CEPI will mean that for a certain number of pathogens, there will be vaccines at the beginning of stage 2 trials. Now, I guess then for me the question is, money is not limitless. What is the, and you mentioned this was in some sense self-interest insurance, you're buying insurance. What is the right level of insurance to buy? How many vaccines how many pathogens should you go after, and what should the scale of this be? You're clearly just starting, this is a very big start, but how do you think of that? And Bill Gates, I'm looking at you because I know that you think in these terms. So what's the ambition in terms of what's the right number to go after or the right scale of this?
The number of potential pathogens out there is far greater than we're likely to do specific constructs for. So, maybe if we're lucky, we can cover the things that are 50% or 60% of the risk. Flu is kind of a special one that we should just go and do. But even putting that aside, there'll be some predictability. And even the surprising ones will have may have some relationship, so that you're able to just change the vaccine modestly, particularly with these new platforms. Ideally, I think we do 5 or 6. At our current funding level, it's more likely that we'll be able to do 2 or 3, but there are some major actors who will participate in this space, including the UK and the US and China, who, whether they come into CEPI formally or they simply take their programs and make sure that they're complementary, like the US BARDA investments, this endeavor will be bigger than the CEPI organization itself. And I'd say broadly, maybe we will get the 10 or so that I think would be attractive. Once we get the 10, then I think the global health community should have a great debate about, should we do 11 or 12? You know, did it go as quickly as we want? At least we will have exercised the, you know, how do you go to the regulator and what do you do about stockpiles? Things, you wouldn't believe every question that should have been resolved in advance of the Ebola epidemic was not resolved in advance. In fact, we can still sort of debate some of these things about trial design that the CEPI construct will force the dialogue to continue and even to be more prepared.
Prime Minister Solberg.
Well, I think I just follow up on the last part there, because besides actually working on concrete vaccines, it's also important to have that discussion on how do we have preparedness for scaling up, how do we have a priority on how we do it. You can do all those discussions that can take lengthy time. When the problem arises, you can do it in forefront, you can have a scheme, you can have an international discussion on the priorities that you are making in a crisis like this, because you are already there seeing the problems that will arise. Well, so I think it's important to say, yes, it's a workable, it's an initiative for innovation on vaccines, but it's also a way of having somebody pushing this agenda so that we discuss how we are better prepared in the future. And I think that is needed because there's so many problems. It's overwhelming in a lot of bodies, also in the World Health Organization, that you should deal with. So maybe there have to be somebody who is advocating and pushing this agenda.
Jeremy.
Yeah, it's unusual for me to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but I think he sometimes did frame some things sensibly. You have the known pathogens that Bill was talking about, and you know, for a world not to be prepared for the known pathogens that could cause an epidemic is unacceptable. And that's honestly the situation we're in today. And CEPI will address that issue. But I think CEPI will do far more than that. My hope is it actually catalyses a new partnership, and in these cynical times, I think a global partnership with the various players in CEPI coming together is actually a real sense of optimism and hope, and I think that's very important. But it will also catalyse the whole technological advance. Bill talked about RNA and DNA technologies for vaccines, of platform approaches, so that we're not reinventing a new vaccine approach every time an unknown pathogen comes. But I think CEPI has to earn you have to earn the right to exist first, and you have to earn respect first. And that's why it's critical that CEPI chooses 1, 2, 3, 4 vaccines, and in the next few years absolutely delivers on those, including, in my view, finishing the job on Ebola. We have a safe and effective vaccine for Ebola, and we actually have more than one candidate. Johnson & Johnson, GSK, Merck, all have very good candidates. But we don't have a licensed vaccine. That has to be finished. We have to be able to have a licensed vaccine that could be used tomorrow when the inevitable epidemic of Ebola comes back.
So the central focus of CEPI will be getting the vaccines and getting the vaccines to the second stage. But as you've all mentioned, there are things beyond that. There's improving distribution schemes, and then presumably there's also something about streamlining regulatory approval. I mean, isn't part of the problem, or wasn't part of the problem, the difficulty of having the time it takes to get regulatory approval? So, Andrew, let's start with you there. Do you think CEPI can play an important role in these things that are sort of essentially outside the lab, if you will?
Yeah, and I think really it's to the point that Bill just made. And what CEPI does is it takes something which historically, in between pandemics, has been treated as a theoretical debate and makes it very crystallized. So if we're working on a MERS vaccine, we can actually sit down with the regulators right now and say, okay, if we have a MERS vaccine which is based on this platform, what do you want to know to discharge your anxieties of safety and the like, and quality? Those debates, it wasn't really about timeline to get regulatory approval. It was having the argument over what is the question you're going to ask in the first place. I'll never forget, in September of the Ebola pandemic, being in Geneva, listening to global regulatory organizations argue with each other over the heads of the industry and the countries involved, whether or not the trials should be placebo-controlled or not. That debate could have and should have happened years in advance, and there should be a pandemic response kit which says, right, we go to phase 3 with this candidate, we've all agreed this is the basis. Liability the same. We still don't have a practical solution for global deployment of emergency vaccines from a liability point of view. And while some people will say, well, how important is that? The reality is, when you take what will always be, even after CEPI, essentially an extremely accelerated development program, and you deploy in an emergency situation, you will find private sector companies reluctant to embark on an open-ended global liability risk. We all know that. The American government resolved it with the PrEP Act years ago, but the rest of the world hasn't moved.
Audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters